pleasure to welcome all of you. And like all of you, I'm eagerly looking forward to hear what Professor Patrick French, Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Public Understanding of the Humanities, and Professor Minal Pathak, who's at the Global Center for Environment and Energy, and has been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are going to share with us today about the time and change in the Anthropocene. So as someone remarked, many of us aren't quite familiar with what the Anthropocene is. I mean, it's, as Murali said, it's the period in the most recent period in which humans have impacted the Earth's ecosystem, not just limited to climate change, but also in other ways. But people don't quite agree on exactly when that started, and I'm sure they may possibly address that. Some would say that it starts 12,000 years ago, while others will say it started 60 years ago after certain nuclear explosions happened. So this is, humans on this planet have accomplished quite a bit. They've created poetry, they've created literature, they've created atomic bombs, and possibly modified the climate so much that we may not have too many generations of humans left to create poetry and bombs. But in recent times, governments and businesses have recognized, and since the last week, re-recognized the urgency of addressing issues of human impact on the climate. And going forward, there is hope that the Anthropocene will last a very, very long time, and humans will continue to exist on this planet for centuries and centuries and centuries to come. So without further ado, I will now invite I think Patrick to start off the session. I believe he will then hand it over to Minal, and then it'll come back to Patrick after that. So go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you very much indeed, Raghu. It's yes, a rather ambitious co-presentation by a climate scientist and a historian on time and change in the Anthropocene. And we will see how it goes. The writer H.G. Wells anticipated in 1932 faster air and land vehicles, armed drones, the abolition of distance, and instantaneous audio and video, all of which we have now 90 years later. He noticed that the motor car had taken society by surprise. Quote, "We did nothing to our roads until they were chocked. We did nothing to adjust our railroads until they were overtaken and bankrupt. And that is what I mean by want of foresight." Wells went on to say that the world is in need of students of the future, or what he called professors of foresight. Quote, "It seems an odd thing to me that though we have thousands and thousands of professors and hundreds of thousands of students of history working upon the records of the past, there's not a single person anywhere who makes a whole-time job of estimating the future consequences of new inventions and new devices. There's not a single professor of foresight in the world. But why shouldn't there be?" Well, today there are people who work in existential risk, but the broad principle that he's saying of humans being overtaken by events created by what they invent, I think remains true. And I want to begin this short presentation autobiographically in the 1980s. Late 1980s, when I was an undergraduate student at Edinburgh University in Scotland. The Green movement was then going through a periodic surge in support, gaining 15% of the popular vote at the 1989 European Parliament election. If I were to place this green or ecological moment socially or politically, it would be in the context of the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, the peace and anti-nuclear movement in Europe, and the intellectual ripples of the publication in 1972 of The Limits to Growth, a report from the Club of Rome which explained the scientific basis of anthropocentric climate change to a global non-technical audience. There is only one planet Earth with a finite supply of resources. This may today seem like a statement of the obvious, but it was not so at that time. The tipping points of the Anthropocene epoch were far distant. At the 1992 general election in the UK, I stood for Parliament as a Green Party candidate, and after losing was invited by the victorious Conservative MP to lunch at the House of Commons to see if I wanted to join their party. But I had other fish to fry. The arguments the Green movement was making at that time have run and run over the 3 decades since, with no clear alternative system emerging, even as sea levels rise, the planet burns, species become extinct, and habitats are destroyed. This conversation and debate predated the economic rise of India, China, Indonesia, and other countries in the 1990s, which obliged us to reconfigure the meaning of rich versus poor countries, since poor countries in per capita GDP terms now contain immensely rich people, companies, and families. We pressed more than 30 years ago for a nation or a community's economic success to be judged by sustainability rather than by production through GNP or GDP. And there have been attempts by Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz, and others to rethink measurements of economic value. But we still live in a world where Amazon, the company, is valued in a different way to Amazon, the rainforest. The latter generates value when it is destroyed and processed, along with the habitats it contains. In making this reference to the two Amazons, I am quoting a former governor of the Bank of England, the Canadian Mark Carney, in order to observe how far ideas that were radical when I was an undergraduate student have now become mainstreamed. I'm now going to hand across to Minal to continue, and then I will rejoin my presentation.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's hard to follow on after you, and thank you, Raghu, and everyone. So I'm going to be slightly less eloquent compared to Patrick. I will need the support of slides. But let me go back to the first point that Pratyush made before some of you joined about the word Anthropocene in the title. And Patrick said we should use it, and I said no because it is controversial, and then we finally decided to go with it. So Pratyush, it is an epoch, like a time period, but it's not official. So there's an Anthropocene working group which wants to name this period as the Anthropocene, but there hasn't been consensus yet. So I think anthropo comes from the Greek word meaning man. And so a group of scientists and geologists want to rename this period because it's uniquely different, and this period as in where humanity has made such a remarkable impact on the Earth's physical climate and features that it should be like an epoch in itself. But I will leave it at that just for an introduction and move on to my presentation. So I'll just share my screen. So just very, very quickly, because we had IPCC in the title and Professor Shukla is here. Many of you might have seen this slide. This is from a typical IPCC plenary where the 195 member governments come together to approve the IPCC reports. The summary is approved line by line. So I just put together a timeline after our conversation, Patrick, of what we've been doing in the IPCC. I have just been 4 or 5 years, but maybe Professor Shukla can say more. But in the 1990, the first assessment report came out, and subsequently there were new assessments on climate change. So it's not like we just know this. It's been at least 2.5 decades ago that we knew about the science. I went back this morning to look at what the first assessment report said, and wow, it was a prediction of the present. It said emissions will rise 1 degree above present by 2025 and 3 degrees before the end of the next century, which is pretty much what we're saying today. So they could say, we told you so. The second and the third assessment reports said that there would be more severe droughts and floods in places, extreme events, cyclones. So it was all said then. That was the future. Some of these reports also catalyzed global movements like the Kyoto Protocol, Paris. But by 2013, we knew, and IPCC said that climate change is unequivocal and human influence is responsible. I mean, it's 95% certain that it's caused by human activity. Paris happened. It was a big event in 2015 where governments came together to agree on the 1.5 or well below 2 degree goal. The 1.5 report came out in 2018. It was an eye-opener. It said we have only 12 years to limit climate change. And there were some positive developments too, right? Technology costs had come down like never before, like Patrick said, solar and wind and etc. Several countries announcing net zero targets. And then you come to 2020, which was really, I just put this reset here because it got us thinking, you know, especially research on climate change, that our models were wrong. We didn't know the growth rates. I mean, Darshini can say more about public transport, all the things we were saying. It required us to rethink, right? We paid attention to COVID, but it was also the year of severe climate impacts. I'm going to run you through a few, but I could just go on for the hour discussing these actually. So I think the first one on my list is this heat wave in Siberia. It was unique because it lasted almost 6 months. There were record-breaking temperatures, like 38 degrees in some cities, which was 6 to 10 degrees above normal. I have this photo from a Russian city. I forget the name, but I have it written down. It's Novosibirsk. It's the third largest city in Russia, where the temperatures on one day were 10 degrees above normal. This is a cyclone Amphan in West Bengal. When it was sort of developing, they said this would be a major cyclonic storm, but it turned out to be the 4th major cyclone in the history of that region, and the most devastating one in terms of economic losses. I think the losses amounted to US 12 or 15 billion. It was not just the economic loss, as Raghu and Patrick both mentioned, it was also the long-lasting impacts where people lost their homes and had to rebuild them. In some cases, the fields were inundated and they lost their livelihood for a year, and we really don't know, we cannot measure these losses. This is the image from the wildfire in Australia. I mean, it stayed with me for long, but there were wildfires in California, as many people know. And I think we lost about 4 million acres of forests there. And the species count was 1 billion. And that's just like an estimate of the species we lost to wildfires. Coming back to India, and some scattered incidents, you know, of the locusts, which now is established was because of climate change. That there was a warmer development in the Indian Ocean, and that led to excessive rainfall in the western states and swarms of locusts in, I think, 6 states in India. The right one is the avian influenza that I think a dozen states are already reporting, and also man-made. This is the virus that can transmit from birds to humans. I mean, some viruses cannot, but this one, H5N1, it's called CAN. And I think the fatality is 60%. This data is from IMF, shows the impacts on GDP for countries from COVID. And China was the only major economy that grew in that quarter. These are results from one quarter. And you can see the dark brown countries, which showed negative growth. It was not just GDP, actually. It was the aviation, tourism. I think flights fell by 80%. And many of us read all of this in the newspapers, right? And some are on rebound, but according to forecasts, the impacts will last for a decade or even more. We saw these images too, but really the inequality with whether you call air quality, the poor experiencing impacts, or the blacks in some Black communities in the United States, or you talk about migrants and informal workers in India, and the list is endless, right? That both climate change and COVID impact the more vulnerable the most. Sorry, we have some nature reports, etc. as reference here, but I'm not going into the details of the numbers. So this is my comfort zone, the emission data. And COVID resulted in the steepest fall in emissions in history, even more than the World War II. So you can say it was more than the financial crisis in 2008. It was more than the Great Depression in the early part of the last century. This is about 8% 8% reduction in emissions per year. So according to estimates, we need a COVID every year for the next 10 years if we have to meet the climate goal of 1.5 degrees. This is, I think, also from a recent paper. I cannot remember. Oh yeah, it's this group, Chinese group from Tsinghua University that studied this. I don't want to explain this figure really, but this one shows, very quickly, I will just explain the big line. So this line shows, at the top shows where we go if we don't do anything. The line at the bottom shows how far we need to go down in terms of emissions to reach 1.5. And the blue lines show where we'll go if we implement what the countries are saying we'll implement. So basically, in some we have a huge emissions gap to reach where we need to go. And the problem is that at the current rate, we are headed for 3 degrees, a temperature rise. And the other issue is that COVID in some countries has displaced the interest and urgency. So you had Greta and the climate movement building up, but in some countries, for example, in Gujarat, the investment in electric buses has been delayed because the governments have channeled all their funding to COVID. And there are estimates, according to UN, that it would fall down on the political agenda at all levels, national as well as local levels, because priority funding would have to go for health. And so there could be potentially very long-term impacts on climate action because some of these take decades to deliver, for example, new power plants, new renewable energy investments. So we are looking at a bit of a dismal scenario here. My second last slide, the message from the 1.5 report that the window is open but closing very rapidly. Both COVID and climate change have a common cause. It's unsustainable exploitation of the environment. According to the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, there are nearly 1.7 million viruses yet to be discovered. And maybe Vivek or some people from Subhash, some people from biology can say more on this. But according to that estimate, 85,000 of these are still have the potential to impact humans. And the IPBES report also says that it's possible to escape these, but prevention is better than reaction. And vaccines can only do so much. So we cannot wait for a pandemic, develop a vaccine, and then wait for the next one. We are at a stage where we have just too many intersections between these crises. There's some good messages too, that many solutions that address climate change, like deforestation, switching diets away from meat, less intensive agriculture practices, changing consumption patterns, etc., can address both climate change and COVID. Sorry, it's my timer. And well, the UN has a very optimistic message in its gap recovery report, saying that green recovery could lead to more climate resilient, low emissions recovery. And they list down some of the elements of the green recovery, including digitalization, including greater inputs into helping the poor, etc. I'll probably come to that if we have time. But I want to pass it on to Patrick with this slide. But I was reading Amitav Ghosh's interview 2 days back, and he says it's all because of the fossil fuel empire, which we are not able to bring down, and that capitalism, imperialism, power, and inequality continue to remain important considerations. So how are we going to deal with this? How far can these be dismantled, or should they be dismantled? If they want to address these. And I would say it is a deep reflection of our relationship with the environment at the moment. There were tons of articles on this, right? How some of us really understood our relationship to nature, but then where are we taking that? And Amartya Sen quotes, and maybe some of you might have read what he wrote also about how governments will need to consult everyone. It's not going to be a top-down recovery. You can no longer tell people what to do, but you can ask people what to do. And so, Patrick, I pass it on to you with this question that we are here, and how do we go down in history, and how will future look at us, and how do maybe our past humans look at us, given where we are and the decisions we took?
Okay, thanks, Minal. So I'm going to also share a few images which connect with what we are talking about. So this is the book, The Limits to Growth, 1972, which in retrospect seems hugely important and influential. This is a site that is going to be familiar to probably every person on this meeting. This is something that we are used to. It happens in Indian cities, it goes away in Indian cities, we move on. This is the other side of the coin. This is rooftops in Ahmedabad dealing with extreme heat. Seeing what can be done in terms of heat action plan, of how you limit in a day-to-day way things like the materials and the color of the coverings of roofs in order to try to mitigate what is happening around us. This is a scene from Tripura during the drought. Again, I'm putting these images up partly because they are familiar, because they're expected. The next four images were shared by the activist Greta Thunberg a few months ago on social media. And again, they've become globally familiar now. The Golden Gate in San Francisco, the bridge lit by these terrible wildfires, these terrible forest fires. She then, with it, showed this image from Khartoum, sudden flooding with all of the immediate consequences. An image from Mumbai, again, a flood and how people cope with the flood. And then this of Arctic ice melting and how that then affects everyday life, travel for people who are living there. And this image, which was not shared by her here, but I think is probably familiar to many of you, taken by a freelance photographer, Christy McClure, showing people going on playing golf while a forest in Oregon was burning in the background. And the point that Thunberg made, which in a way was a very simple point, but it's also a sort of radical truth, was, quote, reporting is not enough, connecting the dots is not enough, mentioning the link to climate crisis is not enough. This needs to be our main focus. It needs to dominate the news all the time. And I think to an extent now, in the early 2020s, that change is happening, has happened, in that the kind of conversations of 30 years ago, what if? What happens if such and such event leads to disrupted weather or a rise in temperatures, is now something that is sort of around. And it's not perhaps surprising then that this meme often gets shared on the internet, this dog having a cup of tea or coffee and then going, and you from this is fine to realizing that you're in a situation where it's happening all around you. And also the sense of one thing happening at the same time as another thing. So you've got a forest fire here last year in California, but you've also got elderly people being told because of the coronavirus pandemic, please remember to wear your mask, wash your hands. So it's one event and another event being like a comorbidity, one happening on top of another. And I'm just going to share two sort of slides with you, which are more technical. This comes from a study of global ocean heat shared by climate scientists from the Breakthrough Institute, Zeke Hausfather. And I've just added two red dots to it. And what I'm showing there is that the amount of heat being stored in the global oceans in a 20-year period from 1995 to 2015 goes from under 100 zettajoules to over 300 zettajoules. A zettajoule being 10 to the power of 21 joules. So, Raghu, you're the physicist, you can tell us that the heat has to go somewhere. We don't know where it's going to go or when, but it's stored there waiting to do something. But also the moment of change to an extent is already happening. This was President Xi Jinping of China in September talking to the United Nations mainly about the coronavirus. and dropping into the conversation the fact that in China they've made a decision to go for zero carbon emissions in less than 40 years. So this is a major public policy change with huge consequences globally, where a government is taking unilateral action. Again, something that we could not have imagined, I think, even a few years ago. And finally, one other sort of technical slide. This is from the European Investment Bank, a recent report on building a smart green Europe in the COVID-19 era. This was cited by the economist Adam Tooze. And I think what's interesting here, talking about climate change mitigation through investment, is that if you add up the figure for 27, I guess, European countries plus the United States, it's still coming in lower than China. So I'm using these slides really sort of illustratively in order to say that change in terms of policy is happening right now. So I began this co-presentation with Minal in 1932 with H.G. Wells, and moved across the green politics of 30 years ago through the present to a world 30 or 40 years into the future. Timescales shorten in retrospect and expand in anticipation. The year 2011 seems recent, while 2031 seems distant. It is not only governments like China who are now making commitments on decarbonisation and net zero emissions to avoid global temperature rise that recently would have been seen as impossibly radical in policy terms. Coal plants are no longer the future, and you're now as likely to find a financial or a banking institution, a large commercial organisation or a global company setting urgent decarbonisation targets to avoid runaway climate change. A report for clients by JP Morgan in 2020 stated, quote, "We cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened." Central bankers like Mark Carney, who I cited earlier, are saying what Greens were saying 30 years ago. He would also argue, as he did in the recent Reith lectures, that rapid decarbonisation will be experienced as an economic boom. Retrofitting buildings, investing in new infrastructure, designing and manufacturing equipment drives green growth. The price of solar energy and utility scale batteries has dropped through the floor in the last decade, and renewable clean power could drive economic growth. By 2030, internal combustion engines are supposedly going to be absent from the European Union. Now, many would argue against this, quote, capitalist reframing of the climate challenge, but it is a major tipping point in conventional policy thinking and in short-term execution. So to close, I'd like to raise some thoughts about time and about change. In the early 1980s, climate scientists, particularly in the US, such as James Hansen, stressed that CO2 emissions could cause catastrophic change in our lifetime or our children's lifetime. And this became presented as an existential warning, with the threat being measured against linear time. As Bentley Allen argued in a 2017 paper, second only to nuclear war, Science and the Making of Existential Threat in Global Climate Governance, quote, "The problem of climate change rests ultimately on a fundamental disjuncture between the differing temporalities of human life and the planet." Dipesh Chakrabarty has written about a, quote, "negative universal history that is, quote, more like a universal that arises from a shared sense of catastrophe and calls for a global approach to politics without the myth of a global identity." In the timescales of the planet, which we prefer to judge in epochs, the seconds, hours, years, decades that we live by in modern time are very, very short. Whatever happens in our lifetimes is cosmically the blink of an eye. And when I think back to how we thought 30 years ago in UK green politics, or hoped for 30 years later, the absent thing, the missing thing, was a sense that the consequences of the Anthropocene may be better understood not in linear time, but as a set of disruptive events that fall one upon another. What a climate scientist might call a fat-tailed event, rare and severe, but increasingly frequent, and a historian might call a moment of accelerated history. The Gulf Stream weakening, an extraordinary heat wave in Siberia, climate migrants having to move across the islands of the South Pacific, the melting of the Thwaites Glacier, possibly unlocking the whole West Antarctic ice sheet, comorbidities where disruptive climate events, megafires, floods, smoke or air pollution, dust storms, insect and locust swarms and plagues caused by strange weather with a link to extreme heat and air pollution of the kind that we know in North and West India every year. And as a footnote, when the sci-fi writer Kim Stanley Robinson wrote a recent novel, when the sci-fi writer Kim Stanley Robinson wrote a recent novel, Ministries of the Future, it was set in a heat-bound UP, Uttar Pradesh, where humans might need to migrate out into the lower Himalaya. Zoonotic pandemics, such as the one we're living through, could make regular visitations. And these are not disparate events, but comorbidities. For example, deforestation will lead to a loss of biodiversity as animals leave their habitat. Wild mammals or bats will migrate. They may be eaten by other animals or by humans, and a pandemic becomes a likely consequence of the climate crisis. The spread of SARS-CoV-2 was not a surprise to public health specialists. Humans infected with the new virus can now fly all around the world since we have an interconnected civilizational and economic global system. And at the time of speaking, the world has now passed 100 million cases of coronavirus. And it's not, I think, a coincidence that countries like the United States, the UK, and the EU have found it especially difficult to adapt to the current pandemic, and their populations have suffered accordingly. But this overlay of events or comorbidities of the Anthropocene should not be seen as a new normal, even if it is familiar. If we switch our point of outlook from Europe 30 years ago to the subcontinent today, it is in a way a familiar view of disturbance. The monsoon floods our roads and changes our daily plans. The electricity goes off and comes on. It's too hot to walk outside for long at certain times of the year because we have long passed 40 degrees Celsius in the open air. The subcontinent is forced to be adaptable. I wrote a decade ago that India is the world's default setting for the future. And in this context, we don't have to imagine climate change because we can see forms of it happening, and we can see how, in an everyday way, adaptation and mitigation are an expected part of life. In this sense, we've moved beyond a sense of Hanson's what-if timelines to a negative universal history, an experience of transformation and reversal, where we manage the present. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, both Patrick and Minal. This is very interesting to see it being talked about, the topic being talked about from different angles. Minal, Patrick talked about the fact that businesses and governments are now taking the initiative to be more green. What's driving that? Is it because there's actually money in it, or is there pressure from the public at all? In fact, related to the last part, if you've been living in the same city for decades, I myself, for example, in Ahmedabad, I could notice the change in the temperature and the way the weather has changed. But I would say that, okay, climate change has happened, but it's happened gradually, over 20, 30 years. Are people linking this climate change with what we are doing to the environment? Or does it just end this way? Oh, it was different in the past, and now things are hotter, etc. Or we're having more hurricanes and more floods. Is the public in its mind, is there a correlation with what we are doing to the environment and the way the environment is and the way the climate is changing?
Thanks, Raghu. Two very complex questions. I'll take the second one first because it was already a point on my slide and I took it out afterwards. And I was just thinking about how people, it's not very related, but how people responded better to COVID, I think, in terms of wearing masks and personal hygiene, etc., compared to climate change, even governments. And because they saw an immediate connection between action and reaction. And they thought, okay, if I don't wear a mask, I'll probably get this and die. But with climate, I think it's not that strong. I wouldn't say that for everybody. I wouldn't generalize that, but I do think that in terms of behavioral action, people don't necessarily see as their own personal actions influencing the climate, because they would see it as a collective action. And therefore, the argument is, what will my action alone accomplish? But I wouldn't say that for general, because there are like, I also meet a lot of people who feel very strongly about this and about how their actions influence, and they're really doing a lot at a personal level. So it depends on context and country. And your first question on why governments are taking it, first of all, I think they're too few and very less ambitious, the action that we have announced. Even UK's goal of 2050 is not fast enough. So I would say they're still quite mild compared to where we need to go. But the actions are like, governments are recognizing the links between, the need to address climate change, but these are like mostly taken in looking at economic interests in mind. So they wouldn't, like a coal producing country wouldn't suddenly shut down coal power plants. It's not possible. But there are countries which have made exceptions, like Denmark now has a law on climate action. But I'll stop here because I see a lot of raised hands.
Okay, thank you, Minal and Patrick, for such wonderfully lucid presentations, very, very thought-provoking and informative. I had lots of questions, but I'll just try and collapse them. And one problem is also that it's so hard to, respond to such a provocation, because does one respond with a policy question? Does one respond with some kind of existential question like, is this a lifestyle problem or a systems problem? In one way, one doesn't even know at what level to respond. I guess one thought I had, either of you, if you have any thoughts, please respond, which is that now the idea that we are in a climate catastrophe or in a climate disaster, in a kind of a slow burn situation, or that drinking tea while there's a fire raging around, unless you're firmly in some denial camp, that has also become so absorbed into the vocabulary of the normal. And in a sense, normalizing through even our reactions to climate change, making it a part of institutional teaching, making it part of government policy, NGO action, etc. In a sense, even the language of adaptation, mitigation, in the sense, is there really, in response to crisis, we've sort of normalized crisis in our language. Perhaps there is no other way to do this. So in that context, I think the Greta Thunberg model is at least interesting, because she does not allow, at least it's a sort of a moral voice which insists on sounding mad in response to a crisis like this. She may be a global activist, etc., but at least she doesn't allow herself to settle into some sort of comfort about what's going on. So, without some kind of Pat answered, is there a way to respond to this kind of predicament? A second very quick question, which I just like to share, more like a teaching anecdote, because I teach some of these things in class. So one problem I've encountered in class, both I think Minal and, sorry, do I have time, Raghu, or I'll stop? Okay, I'll stop. I will stop. Okay.
This question.
All right. Okay. I'll stop.
Thanks.
Well, maybe I'll say first. I think this is really the essence of what the presentation was trying to achieve, Maya, because it was a provocation to say, how do we think about this? How do we think about the fact that I think I'm right in saying that if you look at all of the economic activity that is priced into global markets right now, if all of that is put into effect, that it would lead to approximately a 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise globally. That is an extraordinary idea. And yet at the same time, those same companies, those same banks are unwinding that process because they realize that it is a genuine catastrophe in the making. So I think that the nature of the engagement and the response globally is happening right now in a very different way. And the reason why I think what Greta Thunberg says is so interesting is because all she's really doing is holding up a mirror to humanity and saying, this is the reality of what you're facing right now. Minal referred to also earlier Amitav Ghosh and some of his thinking on this. And it is absolutely baked into the way that capitalism was sort of created as a global system during the colonial period. You look at why is it that there are so many of these great port cities which are going to be massively disrupted if sea levels rise. And they are always sort of imperial or colonial ports of importance where you can sort of see how the carbon economy and the global economy are absolutely interlinked if we're going to think about how to unwind it. But let me go over to Minal. But I think the essence is how do we think about what's happening in a different way without it just becoming completely familiar.
I think the time is up. I'll be very quick and maybe we can discuss offline, Maya. But I think it's also about communicating to different groups, right? Patrick mentioned inequality, and I was just looking at the latest stats, and the top 1% rich globally emit twice as much as the collective emissions of 50%. So it's not all humanity. It's certain groups that are obviously consuming a lot more than their ecological limit, and that's something that we're not saying enough, I guess, right?
So I think we will end this here. It's been a delightful conversation between all of us. There is clearly a problem out there, and everyone's seeing this elephant in the room, but behaving like an ostrich and burying their heads in the sand, it seems. And we, keep saying that there is a crisis, and yet somehow collectively as a species, we don't seem to have figured out what is the right way to address it. And if we don't, we will succumb to the actions of the last few generations of humans who will effectively destroy this planet as a safe place for humans to live. And I'll just tell you, the physicists have already started looking for another planet to move to. But the rest of you will have to give us a few more centuries before we have the technology and figured out the best planet to go to. So in the meantime, I think we all need to tighten our belts and do what we can to make this a safer place for future generations. Thank you so much, Minal and Patrick. This was delightful. And I'll hand it back to Murari.
Thank you, Raghu, for chairing the session and also handling the question and answer. And thank you, Patrick and Minal, for really wonderful and very engaging talk, which is very accessible even for the layman and everyone present here. And I would say that there's an optimism as we are coming out of the pandemic, and the world is realizing, that we have to make systemic as well as other changes at every levels. So I would like to thank everyone for asking questions and engaging with the speakers. And I look forward to meeting you again in the coming months in the intersections. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Murari. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Minal.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.